At the hospital for my husband's broken bone, a nurse handed me a note. Then I saw the camera. It was the sort of night that feels softened and sharpened at once. The antiseptic tang of the emergency ward under fluorescent lights that hummed like a distant engine. The slow, measured beeping of monitors. Corridors lit in pools. I remember the weight of my purse on my shoulder, the way my shoes made a hollow sound on the tile, and how every sound seemed to belong to someone else's life. I remember Rachel's voice, low and careful, as she leaned in and slid a small folded square of paper into my palm. Her fingers barely brushed mine. "Check last night's security camera," the note said. "He is not asleep." If this resonates, comment where you're watching from. For 8 years I had been married to Caleb Whitmore. He was handsome in the conventional way, easy smile, steady hands, the sort of presence people trusted. To friends, we were the practical couple. Me, the person who balanced the ledgers, who reconciled accounts and found patterns where others saw only numbers. Him, the smiling partner at events, the one who called me at noon to ask how my day was going. At home, I managed the bills, the mortgage, the paperwork I trusted implicitly. There was comfort in routine, and comfort in authority. I was a forensic accountant by profession. Facts were my scaffolding. 2 weeks earlier, a car accident landed us in the emergency room. Caleb's left leg was shattered, or so I had been told by scrubs and surgeons and the long cadence of the word fracture. In the days that followed, he assumed the role of the injured husband, wincing, requiring assistance, a long list of needs that I fulfilled because that is what you do when someone you love is hurt. Friends texted. My mother called. I rearranged my schedule to take him to appointments, to staple together forms, to speak softly and arrange prescriptions. It looked, to everyone who watched, like devotion. I want to be very clear about one thing. I did not become suspicious overnight. People do not betray patterns quickly. They weave them. Doubt came in small threads, an off-kilter tone on a call, a text deleted too quickly, a laugh that didn't reach his eyes when someone else entered the room. There were moments that, if collected, formed a picture. A spouse who makes claims of incapacity, but who moves in the margins with a different story. A comforting hand that sometimes felt like a script. There were little performances in our house. Caleb could be convincingly helpless in front of doctors and friends. Moans that arranged themselves perfectly when visitors watched. Heavy steps that somehow mirrored the exact cadence of sympathy. But then, he'd answer calls with a speed that didn't match an injured man. Or he'd leave the room to speak privately with his cousin Megan, who began appearing with uncanny timing. Meals, offers to run errands, suggestions that sounded like solutions. Megan was cheerful, too natural around him, always hovering in that friendly way that hides the line between help and rehearsal. I noticed the patterns because it's my job to notice patterns. I told myself I was being paranoid, and for a while I let that thought lie quietly in the corner of my mind. But I also do not discount my instincts. On the night Rachel slid the note into my hand, something about the way she looked at Caleb, equal parts pity and apology, made the small folded piece of paper heavy with possibility. I unfolded it in the hallway, just beyond the sliding doors where families were shuffled away, and staff moved like a different kind of machinery. My pulse did something rational and something primitive at once. The note didn't say, "He's faking." It didn't put words into the mouth of a nurse who could get fired for gossip. It said only enough to pull a thread. Check last night's security camera. He is not asleep. When you work with evidence, you learn the patience to let it speak. I did not march into Caleb's room and accuse him. I did not take the note as a verdict. Instead, I filed it in the same way I would a suspicious transaction. I preserved it, I cataloged it mentally, and then I moved to collect corroborating data. There are 2 ways to measure courage, the shout and the quiet. I chose the quiet one. I told myself to breathe. I told myself to gather. I started with the things I could control without drawing attention. I backed up the few messages I could access. I changed passwords on our joint email accounts and bank portals, not because I intended to lock anyone out, but because you do not leave evidence at risk if you intend to use it as a shield. I spoke, hypothetically, with a trusted friend who works in cybersecurity. She is someone I could trust not to cross legal lines. She told me what to ask for and what to expect. I went to a lawyer, quietly, to understand my options and the right way to secure evidence so it would hold up if needed. I did not want to act in haste or folly. I wanted to build a case on fact. To my surprise, the footage came to me that way, through a trusted contact who had lawful access and was willing to provide a secure link under counsel. There was no hacking in my story, no invasive midnight forays into systems. Just a chain of custody I could explain if needed. A friend who had worked with the hospital and was able to pull the shift's recordings, who insisted on documentation and confirmation. They delivered a file and I watched it in the privacy of my kitchen, with the kettle boiling and the world asleep. The video was exactly as the note suggested, grainy black and white, the kind of image that flattens time and heightens small gestures. A ceiling-mounted camera in the unit captured the bed and a sweeps of corridor. For a moment, I simply watched the pixels move and felt nothing but the rattle of my own breath. Then I watched again. Caleb lay in the bed as expected, propped and swaddled. Lights were dimmed. The angle made his respirations look soft on screen. Then, almost casually, he swung his leg over the bed. His movements were controlled, slow enough that if you blinked, you might have missed the implication, but deliberate nonetheless. He sat up. He put his hand down, reached for a plastic cup at the bedside table, and drank. He moved without the angst of someone in pain. He rose, put on shoes, and walked steadily out of frame. A minute later, he returned with a bag, tugged it toward the foot of the bed, and began to rummage. Megan appears a short time later, light step, familiar hand on his arm. They talk in whispers. He laughs softly. At one point, the camera catches him gesturing toward a document. Megan nods, then writes something on a pad. You can see their mouths form words too small to read, but large enough to mean intent. There it was in the pixels, a conversation about a sale, a line toward moving forward, toward selling the house. I watched him say, unmistakably, "We can use the money," a phrase that on its own would be ambiguous, but in context, with his voice at ease and his limplessness and act, it read as a plan. They discussed names, amounts, how to present it as necessary. They spoke of avoiding attention. They laughed about how smoothly it was going. Humiliation is a slow-working animal. It doesn't always arrive in the form you expect. The first sensation was not rage. It was the small, precise quality of being seen through as if the world had been turned inside out. I felt as if someone had opened a window into a private theater where a play had been running for months with me in the audience, not the lead. I sat very still and felt my body catalog what I needed to do: preserve, corroborate, prepare. They had rehearsed the role of a patient and the role of the devoted wife so often that their choreography had become second nature. What they'd not accounted for was consistency across contexts. They'd created a stage that dazzled guests, but cameras do not buy the scenery. Cameras accept only movement, sound, and timing, and those betrayed them. Once I had the footage, the rest of the evidence followed like tributaries joining a river. Bank statements showed transfers that could not be explained by medical bills alone. A series of calls to a number linked to a collection agency returned patterns I recognized from my work. Deadlines that were aggressive, demands parked against an account that had been drained. My professional life taught me to trace flows, the origin of a wire, the frequency of payment attempts, the fingerprints left behind in invoices and memos. I traced a series of small, repeatable transfers from an account in Caleb's name to an account associated with a gambler's network. There was a trail of withdrawals and settlements that suggested a debt growing beyond the hospital bills. I also found a pattern in communication, Megan's calls were always timed to moments when sympathetic witnesses were present. Her messages were curated with a tone so perfectly solicitous, it began to feel like a script. Her proximity felt less like family and more like performance. At every step I moved with legal counsel. I documented dates, backed up files, made copies, and organized them in a way I could present. I did not confront them. If you want someone to reveal themselves, you let them proceed until their own pattern betrays them. Confrontation in the wrong moment risks losing proof, and proof was what I needed. Proof to protect my home, my finances, and the truth. There is a discipline to patience. I continued to play the part expected of me, the worried wife, the supportive partner. I took care of Caleb. I arranged his medications. I accepted Megan's offers to help, all the while knowing what I knew. It was a strange space to inhabit, to be tender where tenderness was sincere, and to be strategic where the stakes were personal. To anyone watching, I appeared the same. To myself, I was a different person, focusing, cataloging, waiting. They became bolder. Confidence breeds complacency. At a dinner in our dining room a week after I first saw the footage, Megan suggested we hasten the house listing. "If we get this done now, we can cover the debts and move on," she said, her voice accidentally triumphant. The collectors had started calling our home on a more persistent schedule. There were men who came by in expensive cars and of blunt purpose. They stood in our doorway and spoke to Caleb with casual menace. They mistook my quiet for compliance. They assumed that in the chaos they could bully us into a quick resolution. I used that assumption. I invited one of them, an intermediary, to come by with proof of the debt he claimed. He arrived with a folder and an important-sounding jaw. I let him speak. I let him talk about terms and threats. He showed me papers that were muddled, insufficient, and, crucially, containing anomalies I knew how to read. I watched his face when Megan waved him off, when Caleb muttered something that undercut the threat. Small moments that, when collected, showed the scaffolding was unstable. The collector's own unease began to show. He had expected capitulation, and instead received a composed woman who asked questions and catalogued every answer. The night everything changed began the way so many do, in plain sight. Debt collectors came earlier than expected, 3 of them, suited and blunt. They wanted immediate arrangements. They expected to intimidate. What they did not expect was for me to have a device and for me to have a plan. But plan is too dramatic a word. It was more a sequence of choices. Show the footage, allow witnesses to see it, let the evidence speak louder than anyone's story. I connected my phone to the hospital room's public display through a secure hospital system arranged beforehand with counsel and staff. I had informed the attending nurse and the legal office that I might need to present patient-related evidence in a controlled manner. The hospital administrators were careful and professional. They insisted on documentation and verifiable cause. That was the right way to do it. I had the footage accessible via the secure link provided by my trusted contact. I opened the clip. The image filled the screen. The same grainy black and white footage that had kept me awake at night. Voices I couldn't fully transcribe were clear enough to show intent, gestures to indicate a plan. I watched the room itself change. Caleb lay there, finally rendered helpless by the weight of his own exposure. Megan's breezy smile became a wince. The collectors' faces went from expectation to confusion, then to a kind of anger that is different from shame. Caleb's mother, who had been knitting at the edge of the bed, let the work fall from her hands and began to cry. The room, once a stage of sympathy, became a courtroom of sorts, and the jury was the people who had driven me here, public staff, family, and the men who had come to collect. When the footage ended, there was, for a heartbeat, a silence so thick I could hear the fluorescent lights. Then, Caleb scrambled for an explanation, an apology, a plea. Megan began to stutter a defense. The collectors cursed and muttered about their business. But the thing about documented evidence is that it reframes conversation. They could no longer claim they had acted only out of necessity. The laughter in the clip, the casualness of the conversation about selling the house, the repeated trips from the bed to the hallway, those moments stripped their performance away. I spoke then, not to shame, not to exact revenge, but to clarify my position and the consequences as I saw them. I told the room, plainly, that I would not consent to a sale of the house, that I had engaged counsel, and that any attempt to coerce me into financial decisions made under false pretenses would be met with legal action. I said that I loved the man who lay there from the memory of the person he had been, but I would not be complicit in a deception that endangered my home, my security, and my dignity. Caleb's face, mid-sentence, became a map of someone who had not expected such composure. Megan's shoulders collapsed, as if the performance had been weightless without the audience they'd thought they controlled. The collectors muttered to each other and left, partly because their leverage had evaporated, partly because the situation had become legally delicate. One of them warned me, in a low voice, to be careful. I listened. I documented their visit. What followed was not cinematic revenge. There were no dramatic arrests in hospital corridors. There was process. I filed for divorce. I presented the documented evidence to my lawyer. We notified the relevant financial institutions and law enforcement in a measured manner, always with counsel guiding the steps so the case would stand. My goal was never to humiliate for sport. It was to secure what was rightfully mine and to prevent further abuse. There were, of course, consequences that unfolded quietly. Caleb's health, which had been a stage, became a real medical reality. Bodies have a way of refusing scripts. Complications appeared that demanded genuine care. He was, in fact, in need of legitimate treatment at times. That complexity became part of the grief of disentanglement. The man I loved in parts had fragility that required compassion, while the man in other parts had betrayed my trust. Many people misread that as softening. In truth, it was complexity. I could hold both things, the need to care for a sick person and the duty to protect myself. Megan receded from our lives. She moved away within months. I received a postcard from an address I didn't recognize, and then nothing. Caleb's mother cried in court, and then in private she called to ask forgiveness for not seeing the signs. I gave it with limits. Forgiveness is not amnesty. The collectors backed off when legal counsel made clear the case would be contested for any overreach. Debts were negotiated. Some proved to be legitimate obligations. Others were shown to be inflated or misapplied. The legal process is long and often tedious. It is not revenge. It is accountability. In the months that followed, routine returned in a new shape. The house that had once felt like a stage became my refuge again. I returned to work with the same quiet discipline, but with new boundaries. I cooked simple meals. I learned to enjoy the precision of small acts, folding a towel, making coffee to the exact ratio I prefer, tending to the plants Caleb had always overwatered. I reconnected with friends I had let drift away during the years I was performing the role of steady caretaker. I said no when people asked me to overextend. There is a strange power to the ability to refuse. I met Daniel in a place that had none of the electric stage drama of my former life. A library event on a weekend where he was talking about community projects. He was patient and modest. He listened. With him, there was no rush, no expectation of performance. Our conversations began as small and practical. Books, neighborhood plans, and grew into confidences shared over coffee. He asked questions because he wanted to understand me, not because he wanted to fill a role in his own story. There is always a fear after betrayal, that trust will be given too quickly and broken again. I guarded my heart with the same methodical care I used on my desk at work. Documents first, then small steps. I tested consistency in small ways. I let him see my curiosity about his life and my caution about mine. He never rushed me. He never pressured me to explain more than I wished. That steadiness itself was restorative. The fallout with Caleb was complicated. He sued for some things. I countered with documentation. We settled in a manner that preserved my home and gave him terms that allowed for medical care when truly needed. It was, in the end, less about punishment and more about restoring a life I could live without constant erosion. I found that the most decisive actions I took were not dramatic, but administrative, maintaining my accounts, attending hearings, showing up with documentation. The lawyer I had engaged early on proved vital, not as a weapon for revenge, but as a shield for due process. Friends asked me if I felt vindicated. The question assumed that exposure is the same as closure. It's not. Exposure is the act of truth. Closure is an internal process that comes later, often in small, unglamorous moments. For me, closure came in quiet things. When I sat at my kitchen table without checking messages for a long time, when I slept without waking to rehearse suspicious calls, when I felt comfortable bringing someone into my home and letting him sit on the couch without scanning for a planted recorder. One of the things I learned in the ordeal was about the theater of help and the difference between authentic assistance and exploitation. People who wish to manipulate are adept at wrapping coercion in kindness. They will appear generous, attentive, and self-sacrificing while accruing control. The lesson is not to become suspicious of help, but to cultivate an ability to notice patterns. Does the help come with strings? Is the care consistent across contexts? Or does it exist only when there's an audience? Another lesson was about dignity. I could have made a spectacle out of their deceit. I could have used the footage to humiliate. But there is an irreducible cruelty to public shaming that is rarely productive. It destroys people in a way that rarely repairs anything. My priority was to reclaim what was mine and to ensure their capacity to harm me was diminished. Justice, to me, looked like boundaries set and respected, not like revenge. That distinction saved me from becoming someone I would not have appreciated looking back on. People sometimes ask how I managed to remain calm. The answer is partly training and partly necessity. When you are trained to collect evidence and to build patterns, you become practiced at resisting the urge to react impulsively. Every hasty action risks invalidating what you later need. There is also a strange clarity that settles in when a world you trusted proves false. You suddenly see the parts you can control and the parts you cannot. You choose the first. There were days that were harder than others. The legal papers, the polite but cutting looks from mutual acquaintances, the small betrayals from people who chose not to believe me because believing me would mean confronting a painful truth about someone they loved. Grief is not reserved solely for love lost. It covers trust as well. In therapy, I learned to name the stages and to accept that some losses are not recoverable. But naming is a kind of power too. Naming allows you to set boundaries and to move. In the quiet weeks after the courtroom's final orders, I began to rebuild a routine that felt like mine. I took a class on ceramics because my hands needed a different kind of precision. I spent a Saturday volunteering with a financial literacy group, teaching women how to read a contract and how to protect their accounts. There was a strange satisfaction in turning my experience into empowerment for others. If someone could leave my story feeling better equipped to notice the signs of manipulation or to take a document to a lawyer before catastrophe, then the pain had purpose. There is a temptation in stories like mine to wrap everything in a neat moral, a sentence that tells you exactly what to do if you are ever in my shoes. Life is rarely that tidy, but there are practical points I will say plainly. Keep records, trust patterns over isolated phrases, consult a lawyer sooner rather than later, and preserve your dignity by avoiding public shaming. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are the architecture of safety. When people ask if I regret anything, I say yes and no. I regret the time I lost to convincing myself that the inconsistencies were not real. I regret that my generosity was used as leverage. I do not regret the way I acted once I knew. I will not regret the careful steps I took to protect what I had built with hard work. For me, the line between caution and fear was crucial. Fear closes doors. Caution secures them. My relationship with Daniel is not a fairy tale. It is an honest, slow unfolding. He arrived when I was ready to receive him, not to replace what I had lost, but to build something new. There is tenderness in the small exchanges. Him bringing me coffee because he knows I like it a certain way. Me teaching him how to reconcile his personal budget with patience. We speak plainly. We set boundaries. We laugh at each other's bad jokes. He understands that my scars are not wounds to fix, but stories to respect. I have learned to be gentle with myself about the past. There are mornings when the memory of that night in the hospital returns, and I feel the sharpness of it. There are mornings when it is a distant bruise. Time does not heal everything, but it rearranges the pieces until what remains is manageable. I keep the note Rachel gave me in a small drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the moment I chose clarity. If I could speak to anyone watching who suspects betrayal but fears being wrong, I would say this: preserve the facts, seek counsel, and be patient. Acting without proof can injure your credibility and your cause, but living in denial can cost you your security. There is no shame in asking for help. There is no weakness in insisting that care be real and consistent, and that your dignity be honored. Protection is not a lack of faith in people. It's a commitment to your own safety. People write to me and ask what my proudest moment was in all of it. It is not the moment the footage played on the screen, nor the court papers that followed. My proudest moment is the morning I went back to work for the first full day after everything settled, and felt a small, steady pleasure in a spreadsheet balanced without drama. Pride was tiny and domestic. It was cooking a meal for myself and eating it at my table while the afternoon sun laid a warm strip across the floor. The everyday things regained their value because they were ordinary and mine. There is a final thought I hold on to: the difference between exposure and transformation. Exposing a lie is the first step. The more important step is what you do next. You can let exposure become spectacle and dwell in it, or you can use it as a turning point to rebuild with wisdom. I chose rebuilding. I chose a life shaped less by dramatics and more by sturdy choices. If this story resonated, like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. I tell this not to revel in what happened, but because I believe there is power in documentation and dignity in defense. There is a line between revenge and accountability. I walked it with measured steps, and it led me back to myself.